Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're joining us from. I'm Jennifer Spiegler, and from Cognito. I'm very honored to bring you this panel today, leveraging school and community partnerships to support LGBTQ plus youth during COVID-19 and beyond. We see that people are joining, so we're going to give a minute for them to continue to do that before we start our presentation today. So thank you for taking the time to be with us. Okay, let's start. Scott, you want to give the housekeeping? Okay, so again, thank you for joining us. Today's presentation will be recorded, and a copy of that recording will be sent to you along with the presentation probably tomorrow. You as attendees are in listen-only mode. That means you can't ask questions or talk to us, but you can ask questions using the dialog box on the right-hand side of your screen. If you want to test that out, you can click on the question box and just say hi and let us know where you're from. And if you would like to connect with us on social media, you can connect with us on Twitter. And yeah, that's it. We have a great presentation for you today. So before we start, I wanted to say a few things about Cognito, the sponsor of today's event. Cognito, our mission is to combine the science of learning, the art of conversation, and the power of virtual human simulations to measurably improve social, emotional, and physical health. For those of you who are new to Cognito, we are an award-winning company. Our simulations for K-12 audiences have reached more than 750,000 educators and students across the U.S. And you can see that we focus on communications and empathy to support students all the way from pre-K through high school and on into university on a number of topics. So if you want to learn more about Cognito, you can visit us at cognito.com/products. And today we're talking about supporting LGBTQ youth. At Cognito, we do that in a number of ways, by addressing bullying, by focusing directly on how to support LGBTQ students in school and in the workplace. So I just want to say before we start that we really began our journey working to support LGBTQ youth almost 10 years ago when we launched the first of our K-12 programs. And our key program in that regard is Step In Speak Up, which is a 30-minute learning experience that builds educators' skills and self-confidence to intervene in anti-LGBTQ bullying and harassment. This work has put us together with some incredible partners, including GLSEN and the Trevor Project and PFLAG and Campus Pride, and some local partners like Capital Pride in upstate New York and and around the country in offices like Daniel Moretti's Office of LGBTQ Affairs in Santa Clara County. So let's talk about a little bit about today's presentation. Flash forward. We will first take a couple of poll questions, and then I will introduce you to Daniel and Becca, who you see on your screen. Okay, so thank you so much again for joining us. Can you let us know which of the following roles best describes your job role? School administrator, school mental health professional, nurse, teacher, or something else? I always want to sing do 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 do. Okay, we have about 75% of folks responding, and we have 46% of you who disclosed yourselves as other. If you could write in the chat, in the question box, let us know what other means to you. 17% of you are administrators, 34% are school mental health professionals. And I want to say a nice shout out. I see that we have my friend Kim from LAUSD on the line. It's been a long time. So good to see you and all of you. All right, next. Our second poll question is, how prepared are educators in your school or district to support LGBTQ students? Are you not prepared, somewhat prepared, very prepared, or not sure? I won't subject you to my singing this time, I promise. Okay, with about 71% of the votes tallied, somewhat prepared. Okay, so that looks like there's a lot of room for improvement. What do you think, Daniel and Becca?
Always room for improvement.
And it's good to see that folks are working, a lot of folks are working with the base, so that's helpful too.
That is helpful. Okay, so let us move along and have Daniel and Becca formally introduce themselves. Becca, would you like to start?
Sure. So I'm Becca Mui. I use she and her pronouns. I'm the education manager at GLSEN. Before coming to GLSEN, I was an elementary school classroom teacher for 10 years and working as an equity inclusion director, both in an independent school system and also doing some grassroots organizing in the public school system, mostly in New York. In my role at GLSEN, I take a lot of the things I did as an educator and now try to support other educators who want to make inclusive classrooms. So for GLSEN, I oversee our professional development program. I work with to create our resources, and I also try to ensure that what GLSEN is providing to help make educators have inclusive schools for all of their students, particularly their LGBTQ students, is as available and as easy as possible for them to use.
Daniel.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Daniel Moretti. I use he, him pronouns. I'm program manager at the County of Santa Clara Office of LGBTQ Affairs. Before joining this role, I had about 15 years of experience more in the nonprofit sector in the intersection of arts and social justice, and particularly working with using film-based curriculum that was LGBTQ inclusive to support LGBTQ students in learning throughout middle and high schools across the country. At the county, I oversee our office's logistics and operations, as well as our communications and our community outreach and engagement teams and special projects. And I'll talk a little bit more about our office and some of the projects that we have later on in the presentation.
Great. Okay, so let us move right along and talk about how the pandemic is affecting LGBTQ students. And then we will go on to, and Becca will talk about GLSEN and some of the projects she's working on, and Daniel will talk about some of the work that he's doing at the Santa Clara County Office of LGBTQ Affairs. But first, let's ask, how is the pandemic affecting LGBTQ students?
Thank you. I think this is such an important frame for this conversation and for the supports that we'll be presenting. This is a really unique and challenging time, for schools and for our country, for the world. And I think one of the greatest impacts we're seeing is around students' mental health, particularly increased isolation and anxiety from the persistent uncertainty of the times. And for LGBTQ specifically, especially if they're in an unsupportive home, now they don't have access to leaving the house to what might have been a supportive school or a GSA or the community they could find there. And for trans and non-binary youth who might be home, or for youth who might not be out at home, that can be an increased negative impact of this, especially the shelter-in-place times.
Yeah, and I really agree with everything that Becca's been saying and what we've been hearing, on the ground with the youth we're working with and also our partners that are serving youth. Some of the barriers and challenges that we've heard is that for the youth that are in unsupportive homes, it's a challenge for them to access any of the virtual programming that any of these LGBTQ programs or virtual GSA meetings, because they can't do it in a way that's private or that's safe for them. So we've seen some organizations that have taken some innovative approaches in terms of offering texting options, so that can be done a little bit more privately, no audio included. But definitely we're hearing, the social isolation piece. And also I think hearing some around the Zoom fatigue, or kind of the online digital fatigue, where I think in the beginning we were hearing that there was a lot of attendees and participants at some of these virtual convenings for LGBTQ youth, but because they're doing distance learning, because everything's online, that it's also for some, I think a barrier and a challenge as well.
Thank you. I think also,
no, go ahead, Becca.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump off that idea also, since we're talking about kind of access and disparity, is that one of the challenges and changes we're also seeing is that the inequity that was present in our educational system before is really being exacerbated at this time, particularly for youth of color, system impacted communities, and communities that were furthest from resources to begin with.
Right. And I will say that in our chat box, we have a data point contributed by Tim Kordich of LAUSD, who says we have seen about 200% increase in our LGBTQ hotlines for mental health and suicide ideation. So not to put too fine a point on it, the need has really increased. So putting that framework on this conversation, let's move to Becca's presentation about, or comments about her work at GLSEN.
Thank you. So GLSEN is a nonprofit organization. We advocate for LGBTQ visibility and supports in K-12 schools. And we do that in a number of different ways, as you can see here, and have since 1990. So educational resources and training, that's where I come in. I work in our education and youth programs department to offer, as I mentioned, free resources and programs for teachers and for schools. We also have original research, which I'll go through a little bit more after this presentation to kind of frame what we know about LGBTQ youth experiences in schools. We also have a student leadership youth programs department. We have an incredible National Student Council of 18 young people across the country who really help inform our work as a bunch of adults trying to help and support LGBTQ youth. And they're constantly telling us what we're doing wrong, what we can do better, what's changed. And I think making sure, and we're thinking about having, when we're considering these supports, to have a student-centered approach as much as possible to be sure that the changes that we are implementing, the programs that we have, and that you have with the young people or the systems you're working with, are as applicable to the young people that you're trying to serve as possible. So always advocating for that youth piece. We also have a policy department that's based in DC. They work on grassroots, federal, and when possible, and state-based legislation. And we have 45 incredible local chapters that help put this work in the ground. And so if folks are also, I encourage you to check out and see if there's a chapter near you, if you're looking for more support in the advocacy and the changes you'd like to make. Sorry, I'm getting used to having the controls here. I also just wanted to note that GLSEN has an intersectional approach to our advocacy. As we mentioned about the youth that we're trying to serve, I also like to just note that there is a whitewashing of LGBTQ identity and advocacy in our country. And so it's really important that we're explicit about trying to center our supports around LGBTQ youth of color and the most system impacted youth, so that the supports that we have are creating the greatest impact for the youth we're trying to serve. This is GLSEN's National School Climate Survey. I wanted to just highlight to ensure that folks, especially if you're in that bucket of we have some supports and we're looking for more, a lot of times that means we're looking for more advocacy and more buy-in from stakeholders in your school and in your school system. And so GLSEN research can be a great way to support that advocacy. And I also wanted to highlight that this year's, which just came out last month, is the 20th anniversary, and so it looks at trends across time, and we can really look at how has LGBTQ youth experiences changed and in some ways not changed over time. There is a ton in this report. I will not go into great depth, but I do recommend that you check out some of our GLSEN research websites, the webinars that they have on different topics. But I did want to just highlight that we still found a majority, 86% of LGBTQ students being harassed or assaulted at school in the past year. And that trans students, 84% feeling unsafe because of their gender. And so although there is some shifting in our culture and our acceptance, or at least visibility of LGBTQ people, the supports needed to create supportive environments in schools is as important as ever. I also wanted to highlight that we looked particularly at LGBTQ youth of color in terms of student safety, and really finding that especially in the past year, there's been an increase in racist remarks. Which also brings me to my I wanted to talk a little bit and just highlight and make sure that folks know about GLSEN's latest research on LGBTQ youth of color. So we looked more deeply at the school experiences of LGBTQ, Asian Pacific Islander, Black, Latinx, and Native and Indigenous youth to find out their school experiences. And we did find that 2 in 5 LGBTQ students of color experienced racist or homophobic victimization at school, and that these were also associated with some of the worst outcomes. I also wanted to highlight, as we're talking about an intersectional approach, to make sure that the supports that you have for students with disabilities also has an LGBTQ inclusive lens. A lot of the times when we think about LGBTQ supports in schools, it's put into a separate category, and we're really encouraging folks to think about the supports that you have for youth of color, for students with disabilities, and ensure that those supports also will not misgender folks, will also be supportive of LGBTQ students and their full identities. And we did find in our research the more need for disability justice and LGBTQ justice to be worked together in our advocacy, finding that LGBTQ students with disabilities were more likely to be bullied or harassed at higher rates, to have missed school, and also to be disciplined in school, to drop out or to change schools more than LGBTQ students without disabilities. I also, as I mentioned, was an elementary school teacher, and also just in doing this work, wanted to highlight elementary as well. GLSEN is intentionally K-12. We believe in these supports happening at the elementary level, and to help young people not have to undo or unlearn as much of these supports as possible, or these ideas as possible in middle and high school. And we did find in our Playgrounds and Prejudice report that almost 1 in 10 students reported they didn't conform to, like, quote unquote traditional gender norms. This report also talks about them, like elementary students, hearing people talking about gender and making comments about if gender isn't being presented in a way that they would expect. And we're seeing for these students, which also we would expect that number might be higher now, more than 1 in 10 based on our experiences working with elementary students across the country. But even for these students at this time, we found that gender nonconforming students were more likely to have negative outcomes that we're seeing in trans and non-binary students in middle and high school. So that even at this age, they're more likely to be called names, have rumors spread about them, and they're less likely to say that they felt safe in school. And even in elementary, we're more likely to miss school for safety reasons. So it's really critical that the supports that we are implementing also be done in a K-12 sense with that, and to begin a lot of these supports if possible, particularly around policies, around talking about inclusive families and talking about gender identity and expression and respect, that those conversations begin. Overall, GLSEN research looks at victimization and its impacts. And what we have found is that LGBTQ students who are in hostile school environments where they're facing victimization, assault, and discrimination, they're more likely to have higher levels of depression and anxiety, lower levels of self-esteem and internally. And that also translates to some of their external outcomes, so that these students were less likely to say that they felt they belonged to their schools. They had lower GPAs typically, and they had missed school more recently. And they also were less likely to say they planned to finish high school or to go on to secondary education. And so this is a picture to see LGBTQ youth who were in supportive school environments did not report these outcomes. And so it really is on us to understand what is the supportive environments we can create so that we can make sure that all students have access to both the internal supports and the external aspirations that they deserve. Our research also looks at 4 different supports for schools, and I encourage these as a framework. Especially if you're in that place or you have supports, some of them, and you're wondering, how can we build an inclusive school where all of the stakeholders are involved? And so these recommendations are evidence-based and are tracked by our research, and also are part of our professional development program and something that we know can be supportive in our work with schools. So looking systemically first at the policies and ensuring that they state LGBTQ students, or they say gender identity, sexual orientation, gender expression is such a critical support. Also looking at supportive educators and ensuring that there's the professional development and the resources that they need in order to create that environment for their students and to interrupt anti-LGBTQ harassment or comments that they're hearing in class. Having a student-led club, sometimes called the GSA, is an incredible support that our research continues to find. And we're also finding that even one snippet that was really interesting in our report this year is that we found there was a benefit to LGBTQ students when there was the presence of a GSA, whether they were attending themselves or not. So it really is a message and a space that can make such a big difference. And then inclusive curriculum, ensuring that when we're talking and teaching at school, there is also positive representation of LGBTQ people, identities, history, and events woven into the curriculum. With that in mind, thinking about inclusive curriculum, and also I wanted to highlight around teacher intervention, which we are so delighted to be partnering with Cognito for this week's No Name Calling Week campaign. This is an anti-bullying campaign that really focuses on students taking agency over what they want to be called and putting an end to bias-based name calling and bullying, and really a call to action around this concept, and to put kindness and student safety at the forefront as we begin a new year in January. One of the things we found also is just the power of words, that harassment, verbal harassment continues in our schools, and that this continues to be an issue, and that we found that in our report, almost all LGBTQ students, or 98.8%, heard gay used in a negative way at their school. And so we're still seeing this, and then also there is not the intervention that's needed, that more than half of the students who reported an incident of harassment, or 60%, they said their school staff did nothing, or were told to ignore it. So we know from the research, and we know from our experiences, that so much more can be done. And so we're really delighted to have this week where we are sharing resources and have a lot of virtual participation and events for folks to come together and across the country in different schools to be called into putting a name to name calling, bullying, and harassment, particularly for LGBTQ students, to also partner to have a piece of that support so that educators can actually practice how to intervene, how to create that safe space, and what to do in that moment. I also just lastly wanted to highlight that we have a webinar coming up next week on the 16th that will kind of go over more about the campaign and share some of the resources, and have a sweet student panel where they'll share their experiences and their hopes. And that's all. Thank you so much. I'll turn it over now to Daniel to talk about what he's seeing in Santa Clara.
Yeah, and thank you so much for that presentation, Becca. And thank you also for all the work that GLSEN's doing. GLSEN's research and resources really inform and support the work that we're doing at the county and also the schools that we're working with. So such a powerful organization. We appreciate all the work you do.
Thank you, Dan. I'm so happy to hear that.
Great. So again, I'm Daniel Moretti, he, him pronouns. So I'm with the County of Santa Clara Office of LGBTQ Affairs. So we are a county level office. We're part of a larger division of equity and social justice. So within our division, we have a total of 7 different offices. And it's really so that we're taking an intersectional approach when it comes to our equity work. Our Office of LGBTQ Affairs opened in 2016, and we were the first county level office of its kind. So doing this work for LGBTQ communities on a county level. We are what I would call a programs and policy office. Sorry about that. So we are a programs and policy office. So we kind of have a two-pronged approach to the work that we're doing. So internally, we work to provide best practices, technical support, and policy for county services so that they're LGBTQ responsive and inclusive. And then the second approach is we work externally in the community to provide support for LGBTQ people to thrive. So I'm going to talk about one of the approaches that we've been using when it comes to supporting LGBTQ students. So it's going to be touching upon what Jennifer was sharing at the beginning of the webinar around the Step In, Speak Up module. So our office has partnered with our county's Behavioral Health Services Department, and we purchased the bulk amount of these licenses for this training as part of our MHSA or Mental Health Services Act funded programs. So our office has been distributing these training licenses at no cost to the middle and high schools across the districts within our county. So I'd share that because it might be a model that you consider when it comes to potentially working across the schools in your district, or perhaps districts that are in surrounding areas teaming up and kind of collaborating together when it comes to exploring the different training approaches that you'll be doing to support LGBTQ students. So we often share this statistic that we have on this promotional flyer for our use of the module, which is from the Trevor Project, and that LGBTQ youth who report having at least one accepting adult were 40% less likely to report a suicide attempt in the past year. And for us, that really illustrates the importance and real life impact that this training for educators and school staff can have on the lives of LGBTQ students. So I know that Jennifer touched a bit upon this module, but if you're not familiar with the training, it includes sections both around terminology, but also conversation simulations that are a little bit more interactive. So we had planned and already coordinated to use this training before COVID hit. So now that we're in this time of distance learning, it's of course helpful that the training is online and made available that way. But the feedback that we've been hearing so far in rolling out the training is that we've heard positive response about it being on demand because we know that schedules right now are particularly impacted. So it can be taken as per availability, but also that it's short, yet it has significant substance. And we've also heard a lot of feedback around the simulated activities of interacting with the student being particularly supportive when it comes to learning and growth. I'll share also just a couple of ways that our different districts and schools have been integrating and using the training, just to think about different approaches and just kind of hearing, I think, a sampling of them. So some districts are rolling out this training along with other Cognitos trainings. So for example, the suicide prevention module that our county is also using. And really it's to take kind of a more holistic approach when it comes to supporting students. Other schools are thinking it more within kind of their wider strategic plan for other LGBTQ supports or trainings. So having this be one component of multiple others that are all LGBTQ focused. And others are using it more as kind of a one-off opportunity. So kind of utilizing their designated PD or professional development days and having this be the focus. And because it's 30 minutes, it can be completed within that individual session. After the webinar, you'll get an email from Cognito that will have some of the resources that we've shared in this presentation. And included in there will be the webpage that our office created for this module to kind of get a sense of how we rolled it out, to get a sense of how we communicated out with our districts when it comes to its use and the importance of its use. So I'm going to also share a little bit more about what we've done in partnership with the County Office of Education when it comes to supporting the learning that comes from this training. So we have a really fantastic colleague, Christina Aparte at the County Office of Education, and she developed this participant note-taking guide. And it's to be used alongside with the training. And it contains some of the key terminology and guidance from the training so that it can be used and referred to. But it also has spaces to jot down personal learnings, what stands out to them, so that hopefully it'll be a resource that will have a long shelf life that educators can refer back to and refresh, both in terms of taking the training again or referring back to their notes and to support their learning through taking it. In addition to the work that our county's been doing for, along with the Step and Speak Up module, our Santa Clara County Office of Education also has been a pretty robust LGBTQ initiative and work. So thinking about other national partnerships, we gave the example of partnering with Cognito. Our Office of Education is collaborating with the National Out for Safe Schools campaign. That's out of the LA LGBTQ Center. And it includes elements such as district staff wearing badges to publicly identify them as allies, also opportunities to participate in trainings in order to help make schools a safer and more welcoming place for LGBTQ students. They've also hosted during shelter in place a virtual LGBTQ plus flag raising ceremony to really have a public display of affirming LGBTQ people. And they developed a LGBTQ info and resource guide for supporting LGBTQ youth that includes both local resources and also national resources and guidance and tips. They have all of these elements on their landing page, their LGBTQ landing page for the County Office of Education. So we'll make sure to include that as well in the resources that you'll get after the webinar. So our county, we've also looked at other ways that we can integrate trainings and capacity building when it comes to supporting LGBTQ students. So a lot of them are in partnerships with local community organizations that are doing work nationally and within our communities. So one is that we've been working on is a training with an organization called Reflection Press that does children books publishing. And they're doing a gender wheel training, and it's really around taking a more holistic approach to gender, and it's with a particular lens for early childhood. We're also in collaboration with our Behavioral Health Services Department, doing trainings with the Family Acceptance Project. It's a really impactful project out of San Francisco State University, doing national work, and it's really focusing on the impact that affirming behaviors from family can have on LGBTQ youth. And lastly, we're working with a nonprofit called Knox Teen that's been doing some work when it comes to an Olin Girls curriculum. And that really centers on providing a kind of a train-the-trainer model for youth who are girls or gender expansive and are involved with the juvenile justice system. And really to have more of the youth kind of voice and participation when it comes to systems involved and systems change. And in particular, centering LGBTQ youth of color. And I did want to kind of touch upon what Becca was sharing when it comes to really centering the experiences of LGBTQ youth of color. And the really, really informative and insightful research that GLSEN has that tells more about their experiences and the experiences of LGBTQ students of color. Our county recognizes that LGBTQ youth of color experience unique challenges and barriers and often are the most underserved in our community, in our county. So we've partnered with the National Center for Lesbian Rights and another kind of national and local partnership collaboration to launch the initiative Support Out. And it's really focused on supports for LGBTQ youth of colors and their families, which will benefit all LGBTQ youth. And one aspect of that work is really around integrating and centering youth voices into this work, having youth be active, collaborators, and really, leading this work when it comes to supports that are impacting their own lives. So I'm going to be showing a clip that we've done. It's a panel conversation. It's LGBTQ Youth of Color Lived Experiences panel that was part of an LGBTQ summit that we did virtually. So you're going to hear some experiences and thoughts from LGBTQ youth, particularly that have also been systems involved, about what resources they say would have helped to support them as they were growing up. And I want you to think, as you're watching the clip, what stands out to you the most from this conversation? After watching the clip, we're going to have an opportunity to kind of share what stands out to you or what's resonating to you, and we can share it in the chat box. So I'm going to place just a short, about 3-minute clip.
I think a resource that would have been beneficial for me growing up were just more people around me that are LGBTQ affirming rather than the opposite of that, which a lot of people in my life were, because I would have come to terms with myself a lot sooner had I not been in the back of my mind thinking, fuck no, I can't be that, that's disgusting. So it would have been really helpful to have people around me that support the LGBTQ plus community and queer identities.
I agree with what Aaliyah says. I think if I was surrounded by people who were in the LGBTQ plus community, I feel like I definitely would have came out sooner and realized who I was sooner, and I wouldn't feel like I was alone. And yeah, that's pretty much it.
I think that's like a really big issue that a lot of LGBTQ youth face, is the feeling of being alone. So I think if there were other people like us around us, that would have been really beneficial.
Thank you. Just a follow-up question that I would like to ask. Who do you believe should provide those resources?
I think those could be, honestly, I think schools should provide LGBTQ affirming resources. I know that's like a controversial topic because a lot of people think, oh my God, you're going to brainwash my child into becoming something they're not. But I think that that's just not the case. I think that the people who do need those resources is going to be extremely beneficial towards them. And I think schools, especially elementary schools and middle schools, should provide those resources.
I agree with that. So I like that idea, of putting them in like schools and stuff. But as like a little group or something, like, kids could get together like with like an adult, like a counselor or whatever, and just, talk to them, like ask questions if they needed, or have like little posters in the classroom. And it could be like a little mental health room where they could go and take like a 15-minute break or whatever it may be that they need. But I do like that idea for younger kids in school and stuff.
Sorry about that, I was muted. So that's just a snippet of a longer conversation. And I'm going to also afterwards, Cognito will provide the link to watch the full conversation and full panel with the youth. So want to encourage you to watch it. It's really powerful, and it's all youth-led in terms of the panel conversation. But want to just pose the question to you all of our panelists out there. If you have any reflections, type it into the chat. What, from hearing from this youth in this conversation, what stands out to you the most, or what resonates? And maybe to get us started,
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead,
Daniel.
Oh, I was just going to say to, kind of get us started. I don't know, not to put anyone on the spot, but Becca or Jennifer, was there anything in, seeing the clip that resonated or stood out to you?
Yeah. Oh, I love this clip. I love this whole video. Highly recommend folks take, it's like the half hour to watch it. It is so important in recentering. I think sometimes as an adult in this work, and especially someone, this is like my profession, this is what I've been doing for 17 years, is working in equity and education. And really, it never ceases to surprise me how powerful it can be to hear young people just in their own words saying why this matters. I think I come in, especially the neurostatistics, someone should care about this, and just like really so simply of like, I just want, young people just wanting to be themselves and wanting to not feel alone and wanting for that to be okay. And it's just such a clear message that I think so many of the folks that work in education, you could resonate, whether you understand the terminology, the identities, all the background behind it. I think that just really resonates.
What strikes me, I was almost in tears watching this video the first time I saw it, and it's so moving. Partly, I think, because it's so simple. Their pain is so evident, and the solutions of being able to connect or having a place to go, having that be school, which is really the universal institution for all kids, makes so much sense. And it feels like such a simple solution to this huge problem for kids. And well, the other thing that really struck me, and to go back to what Becca was saying about elementary schools, one of the youth mentioned, this should really be elementary and middle school focused. And I think even at Cognito, we've focused really our efforts in sort of the middle and high school range, but that need to really drive that acceptance down to the very earliest school ages, I think is really an important takeaway for me personally, but also for me as an institution or a link to the Cognito world, because that would be a next step for us in our work. And I noticed that there's a question in the question box here: is there a step and speak up component for elementary? And I would love to be able to say yes, but indeed there is not. So let's talk about that in a few months. I don't know, Daniel and Becca, I don't know if you can see these responses, but we did, they just refreshed in my window here. So
unfortunately, I can't see the question.
You can't. So yeah, so I'll let people, I'll tell you what people said. What struck Alana is the visibility, importance of representation. Rachel said the lack of feeling safe to come out. Jennifer said, the different Jennifer said, the small acts that make a big difference. Bianca said, I would love to have something in the elementary setting. And it goes on, but her question, the question is, how do we get parents on board and not fight it? And maybe the two of you could talk a little bit to that. The Family Acceptance Project has done all this profound work about the importance of family acceptance. But could schools, and we have a lot of school counselors and school administrators on the line here, how do schools engage with parents without touching that cultural third rail? Who wants to take that? Becca?
I could speak kind of more broadly some of the approach we have, if that works, and then first, this always comes up in our work. GLSEN started in the 90s. This is persistent, like buy-in, right? It is helping that educational piece. And I think that a family inclusion is so important, especially, you know, it was my work in elementary schools. You're half working with the families and working with their young people. I really feel like my time as an educator is split between those. And I think it's really important that families be valued part of any school support and any school changes, and of equity initiatives as well. And I think a lot of times our work with administrators is to help them tease out the difference between pushback and questions. And there's a lot of everything we consider as pushback, and a lot of times families, you know, no adult raising a young person wants to have that child come home and say something they didn't know was going to happen, or they weren't prepared to talk about and be surprised. And so I think just making sure that we are inclusive when we're, and really clearly communicating, this is our schools, because of our school's values on respect. This is how we are talking about people that exist in the world, about the diversity that exists in the world and in our community, and in communities around us. And this is why, but also to hold space and invite them in for what it looks like and sounds like in the classroom, and so they can model that language and feel included in that process.
Daniel, you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I really appreciate that, and I think the other, like what we've heard from some of the educators, and what's standing out to me as a principal within one of our districts that was also a panelist in another session we did at the LGBTQ summit, is that they were a really strong support for the LGBTQ students at their school, and being visibly an ally, being visible part of the community, being visibly affirming, and having the conversation with their students that come to approach them and asking them, you know, when they're doing parent-teacher conferences, what are, you know, the pronouns, what are the names that you want me to use in front of your parents? Really, you know, kind of having that that conversation. And even got to the point where I think the trust that was built, that there were multiple students that asked this principal to be with them, with that student when they came out to their parents, to, you know, answer questions, to provide supports, linkages to resources. So I think kind of going back to that statistic of, you know, having at least one affirming adult in your life, that, you know, that no matter what your touch point is at being a school, whether it's a counselor, administrator, an educator, that if you can serve as that, you know, affirming adult, just what kind of impact it can have. But I think not minimizing, you know, asking the questions to the youth about their family dynamics, about their questions. And as much as they're comfortable talking about or coming to resources, as long as you open that door and know that you're there to talk about it, I think that that helps to start the conversation. And I also highly recommend looking at the Family Acceptance Project resources. I'll make sure to also include those. I'll add those to the resources. They have them both in English and in Spanish, and I think maybe some other languages. But I think, you know, consulting some of those resources can be supportive as well.
Thank you. I also, that made me think, do we have time for me to add a bit to that? Just,
sure.
It also
and
makes
then
me
I have some questions that have come in too, so go ahead.
Okay, super quick. Just the importance of having a proactive approach to LGBTQ inclusion, because a lot of times there is reactive, and then it becomes, while we want to always follow young people's lead in their particular where they are in their comfort, and there is actually a right to student privacy for schools to respect and not communicate to families if that's the student's choice, names or identities that they're using in schools. It's also so helpful to have this proactive approach, so that these changes are happening, and then the students can benefit from them, and have that culture shift not necessarily dependent on one particular or set of young people.
Thank you. And that brings up a comment that just came in from Lisa, who says one of the biggest struggles with elementary students is that everyone thinks that a child as young as they are don't really know if they're gay, transgender, bisexual, or whatever. And I think that really speaks to what you said, Becca, about the proactive stance that schools can take.
Absolutely, and I think there is research and there is increasing stories and examples of elementary students identifying as trans, even in pre-elementary, pre-kindergarten schools, pre-K schools, and also increasingly identifying with sexual orientations that are not heterosexual. But I think it is important in these, when we're looking at a larger approach to elementary inclusion, especially if that's the beginning, that we're focusing on just the gender binary and identity, allowing young people to break stereotypes and to ask questions for themselves about how they want to be, what they want to play with, those types of really addressing the gender binarism that's really present, particularly in elementary and early childhood education, and also to talk about LGBTQ inclusive families, which are a large part of our schools, and in a very easy way to have an inclusive curriculum, because family studies are so standard in elementary education.
Yeah, there's a question here, and I don't know, Daniel, if you know with regard to California, or Becca, if you have a sort of national perspective about the law to provide support and LGBTQ resources in schools. Is there, I know there's a School Improvement Act that has never passed, but maybe you can say a little bit about that from the national and the local Santa Clara perspective.
Yeah. Daniel, do you want to go first this time?
Yeah, sure. So I could provide kind of more. So California specific, there is the FAIR Act, which is, requires LGBTQ inclusive curriculum. So that's, and I can also send our County Office of Education on their LGBTQ page has a really great summary of what are the different federal and California legislation when it comes to LGBTQ, I think curriculum, but also resources and supports. So I could provide that because that's going to be a lot more comprehensive than, I'll be able to kind of off the top of my head be able to refer to. When it comes to, so I think it's because in California, we do have, I would say, somewhat robust, I think, legislation. A lot of what our county's been focusing on we don't have like specific Santa Clara County policy when it comes to that. It's more around the technical assistance, best practices, and guidance about implementing those policies. Because we know that, in a policy is great, is fantastic, that's one thing, but that's one step, right? How that's implemented, how well it's implemented, how effectively it's implemented is another piece. So that's really, what we've been focusing on.
I think that's such a helpful distinction also to make. And what I can speak to, there isn't particularly a federal mandate, but what there are federal protections for students in terms of they have a right to receive an education that is a supportive learning environment and that is free from bias-based bullying. And so there are different ways that we can find protections for LGBT students at the federal level, which we're also very hopeful that in the near future we can make some more gains and take some of the things that have rolled back in the last couple of years in terms of particularly LGBTQ youth and youth of color protections that we're hoping. But what you can find is best practices and guidances. GLSEN has model policies for trans and gender nonconforming students, and also around bullying protection and what that looks like policy-wise, what the language should look like. And then we do have state-based and district-wide as well.
And Charla volunteers that the legal question may be referring to new Education Code 218, LGBTQ pupil resources. CDE has posted a website that will be added to. So that sounds like California law. Can you hear me? I'm getting sounds in my headphones. You can. Yes? Okay.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Apple is telling me my headphones are dying.
Got 7 minutes.
So, yeah. And then Alana says, my district introduced a curriculum addressing gender diversity last year. We're struggling greatly with parents not understanding the difference between gender identity and sexual orientation. And my totally self-serving answer would be, introduce them to Step and Speak Up, because that is very well explained in a compelling and audio-visual way there. But if you look at the GLSEN resources, if you look at the resources that Daniel is sharing, when you get the email tomorrow, I think, you know, I think people get, it's not that it's so confusing. I think that people get tangled up in their own minds because there is some cognitive dissonance or kind of cognitive overload or something that they don't really want to see. Does that seem to make sense?
Yeah, and I think also, you know, it can be, you know, being upfront and honest, it can be confusing for people that maybe have not thought about, you know, sexual orientation, gender identity. It's not been something that has been present or, you know, I think in the forefront of their lives. So it is, you know, a journey. It's a learning experience. And I think having a variety of different resources that could hopefully meet people where they're at, and it might look different for different folks. So I think, you know, as many resources that can be consulted, you know, multiple different approaches, and, you know, also thanking the person that shared that comment to their commitment to, you know, rolling this out and knowing that, you know, it's going to probably be an ongoing journey. There's also, I can also share, there's some great resources also from Gender Spectrum that can be useful, especially when it comes to like with families and in the classroom. And some great elementary level resources too is from Welcoming Schools. So HRC has some great resources that's more geared towards elementary age as well.
Yeah,
that's great.
I agree. I think a lot of times elementary resources, sometimes I almost want to like take that label off and be like, beginning, I'm new to this. And I think the way that we would explain that to young people, it's anyone who is new to these topics, to these ideas, can get can benefit from these resources. So I would wonder for these folks, like if they've done kind of an audit of what's being sent out, and if it's, here's like lots of different things that can get overwhelmed. So maybe just one pointed resource that like addresses like identity could be a helpful follow-up. And even I would just offer having an information session. If you're getting a lot of questions around the same thing, to have a little someone on staff or someone that can come in from an LGBT center or a GLSEN chapter to just present on this topic and what this is, and invite questions and what it looks like, how you're addressing that in school. So just if that's can be an offering, that an invitation, a coffee and conversations, you know, virtual meet for families around this, just to give them, just to have them feel invited and to get that question answered if that's something they're holding.
That's great. I could imagine this as 5-minute part of a curriculum night conversation with parents in elementary school. You know, this is like, we're going to ask your kids what pronouns they prefer, and you know, sort of take it from there. We are coming up on the end of our hour, and so I primarily want to thank everybody who joined us today, and especially thank Becca and Daniel for sharing so much valuable information, insight, videos, compassion, and passion for this topic. And remind people about Becca's webinar coming up about No Name Calling Week, and the opportunity to use that as an opportunity to try Cognito's Step and Speak Up. And contact Daniel if you are living in Santa Clara County about all of the groundbreaking work that they do over there. We, as Daniel mentioned, we work with the Office of Suicide Prevention as well as with the Office of LGBTQ Affairs and the County Office of Education. And I have to say they are a model of cross-sector, cross-agency collaboration that it is just wonderful to see. It makes everything just work smoother, I think. So hats off to you guys for that. Any last words?
Just thank you to everyone. Yeah, really appreciate the work that you're doing, and you know, you being here present really means a lot.
Yeah, same. Just really gratitude to Cognitive and you, Jennifer, for putting this together and creating this space for us to come together and talk about this topic. And gratitude, we talked about Zoom fatigue, and we know it's real. So thank you for choosing to spend an hour with us and for this time. Really appreciate that.
Stay safe, stay healthy, and thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone. Take good care.
Take good care.